Okay, hello, we're going to talk about supply side policies today, and the aim of this is to try to make your work more applied and your evaluation clearer and more developed. Many supply side policy essays are just very thin. They don't really get into the really good debates that you can engage in this topic. So the first thing I really want to point out, obviously you need to know the definition of supply side policies, but the really important thing is in any essay you want to be using both types of policies if you haven't been directed to one. So you want to be using the government-led attempts, and you need to be able to define that at the beginning of the essay. They generally correct market failure, and they're generally the provision of public goods or merit goods. And market-based policies, these are governments removing themselves from markets and encouraging competition. So removing government limits, removing anything that prevents incentives and competition from taking place. The other policies there, I'll leave you to read through yourself. So first thing to do is to look through these different policies and have a go yourself. So what we're looking to do is to look at which factor of production, land, labour, capital, enterprise would be affected in the long run by each of these policies. The second thing to do is to take a look at the immediate short-term impact on spending. These policies generally will also shift the AD curve. Now that's not directly relevant to a supply-side policy essay, but you could mention it if you were evaluating with the view that some of these are long-term policies. They are, but they also have short-term demand-side impacts. And you can think of an evaluation, what kind of issues you're creating, and just as a hint, the interventionist policies, which are here, generally have the opposite effect to the market-based policies, which are down here. Okay, pause it now, have a look through and see what you think. Okay, and the answers are on the next slide, they're on the next sheet. I want to just quickly develop some of these ideas about the answers we see on this sheet. So education and health. Firstly, the factor of production that's improved is labour. Now, how does that work? Well, when you have your graduates coming out of university, when they go into the labour force and they then work, they are going to have a higher productivity and they're going to contribute more to the economy, resulting in more GDP. The interesting thing is that that might actually take place over the entirety of your career. So that might be a very, very long-term effect with a lag from when it begins from when you begin your education to when you end, that could be a long time as well. So you're going to see a long time lag for this policy. The demand side impact is going to be the physical building of the school. So physically building the school, the bricks, the mortar, paying the builders to do it, that's government expenditure. And that's relatively short-term, relatively quick effect, I suppose you could say. Infrastructure development. Many of us forget that infrastructure is capital essential for economic activity. And so it is capital, the roads and the fibre optic broadband lines and things like that, they are all capital, but they also are generally government expenditures, generally funded by the government, sometimes by firms, but generally by the government, and that's going to shift AD2. Income tax cuts. Well, if you increase people's, and the key word here is post-tax income, if you increase people's post-tax income, you are going to increase their expenditure, and that's going to increase consumption. However, at the same time, you may well incentivize those workers to work harder. And you can do that in two ways. If you're going to talk about income tax cuts, take an example, use the UK as your example, and I would look at two different brackets. I would look at the personal allowance. The personal allowance in the UK is £12,570, and that means that for the first £12,570 that you earn, you pay a 0% tax rate. If you wanted to lower that effective tax rate, what you would do is increase that number to say £15,000. That then means that everyone who's earning income is going to see a lower tax rate with a disproportionate impact on the lower income earners. You could also do something else, which is to lower the top tax rate. So we've got a 45% top tax rate above £150,000. That's an above symbol, and that's at 45%. We could drop that tax rate to say 30%, and then you would be more incentivized as a result. Now, the incentive effects of each of these are quite interesting. Now, this obviously people's post-tax income is rising, so you're going to see people in employment, they're going to work harder. Maybe they're more incentivized to go for that promotion. You're going to see harder work through greater incentive. So you might say take on extra work, you might go do a bit of extra time, or you might go get that promotion that you would have otherwise not been incentivized to get. Equally though, I think possibly the bigger effect is a transfer of into employment. You've got some people in benefits. They might now be incentivized to go and look a little bit harder for their next job, and so you get benefits going into employment. That represents a big increase in productivity because you've got someone who wasn't producing anything now who's producing. You might also have discouraged workers, for example, people who are not in the labour force, who then go into employment. So you could say have your person who is already retired, they've got a pension, they don't really feel like working, but when they see that their post-tax income is rising from, say for example, minimum wage work, they may then enter the labour force. This therefore has an interesting impact. You're dropping the top rate of tax there is going to make income inequality rise. Increasing the personal allowance is going to make income inequality fall. So you can choose which one you want to do, but equally, both of them are going to have a cost to the government in terms of tax revenue. You may argue that the top rate of tax, that one is a better thing to do because the marginal revenue product, the productivity of your CEO, who is the top income earner, might well be higher than the MRP of those in the bottom levels of, lower levels of employment. And therefore, by incentivizing very productive workers, you might actually have a bigger impact on productivity. You can argue this lots of ways. There's no real clear outcome to that. But taking both sides could be a really good thing to do. That's so much more then than just saying cut tax, incentivize workers. You can go into so much more detail there. One thing that we did mention when reducing tax on the poor workers, the lower income workers, by increasing the personal allowance was that idea of switching from benefits to the minimum wage. Now, if you reduce benefits, you are then, this is another way of reducing the gap between your minimum wage, your post-tax income, so what do you get after your tax, minus the benefits. If you look at that, the gap between those two things, the bigger it is, the more the incentive it is to move from benefits into the minimum wage. What we just did before was we reduced tax and increased, therefore, the post-tax income for those on the minimum wage. But we could reduce benefits and then force those people to go and find jobs. Now, there is another argument to say that we could reduce the minimum wage. Now, that's a very debatable position, and I think a lot of researchers suggested that that may not actually do what we want it to do. The idea being that if we reduce the minimum wage, then people on low incomes will be more incentivized to do extra time, to try to pay their bills, to try to survive, and therefore they're going to work harder. The flip side of that is that if you have job seekers allowance and a benefit system in place, it might actually mean that by reducing the minimum wage, you're actually transferring those in employment into benefits as they get disincentivized. That all depends on the system you're talking about. But in general, I think generally minimum wages are incentivizing for those to get more education. There are arguments both ways. You can really get into a good argument there. And trade union power, we just need to know, raises the equilibrium wage rate, and so by reducing that, you have to then work harder to get yourself higher wages. Specifically, reduction in benefits, that's a nice one because it improves the government budget, and you may well combine that, say, for example, with education and health. So you give with one hand and take away with the other, and you fund one from the other. That could be a nice two policies to combine together. Just to point out that we've had a number of different inequalities in each of these. We were talking a little bit about evaluation here. Regional inequality for infrastructure development. If you build it in the right place, you can develop a poor section of your country. So for HS2, for example, connecting the north and the south, the poorer north to the richer south. But we talked about wealth inequality here. Corporation tax cuts might mean that share prices rise as you have greater dividend payments to shareholders, for example. Deregulation and privatization, again, share prices rising, asset prices rise. And all of these ones here would be income inequality as well. Okay, great. That's pretty much it for those. Just one more final point, that if you're doing anything to do with corporations and making more profit, corporations, when they make more profit and want to compete with others, will try to hopefully build capital. That makes them more efficient, and they're only going to want to become efficient if they've got competition and they've got enough post-tax profit. These two here are giving you more post-tax profit and giving you more competition to incentivize that investment, which is capital, which is a factor of production, all of which are shifting LRAS, which we can see here. Pause the video, take a couple of minutes just to fill in those gaps. Very standard annotation of a LRAS diagram. You generally tend to skip out these logical chains of reasoning. So if there is an investment into education in the economy, the quality, you're talking about the quality or quantity, you want to pick which one that is, of labour, you want to mention that it's a factor of production, and that will cause, therefore, the productive potential of your economy to increase. Don't miss any of these things out. LRAS shifts right to LRAS 1, real output has risen from Y to Y1, and also the average price level from P to P1. Very standard, just basic, bog standard thing, but don't think that you have to write anything more, you have to spend all your time writing something more complicated. Now, the most likely evaluation you would then put after that, so this is an example of how you would evaluate that point, would be the use of opportunity cost. If you're doing any interventionist policy, it's going to be opportunity cost. So you can state these 4 points. Give those a read, and then think about how Bangladesh evaluate that decision. You just shifted the LRS, you just explained how it works. Now explain, why is the opportunity cost a problem, and to what extent might it be a problem, using those points. You pause the video, give it a go. Okay, welcome back again. That's the example answer that I would give, and I've put lots and lots of application, lots of ideas in there for you to think about. You really do want, in these applications, in these evaluations,